think one of the things that's a responsible way to approach any changes in our work right now, and honestly, responsible in the sense of why is the arts even here to begin with, is that it's not about going back to programming as usual. It's about saying, you know, we gotta put trust in artists and in children and in anybody to solve problems, right?
Right.
And arts education has always been making take in most communities. However, there's a reason why juxtaposition was completely targeted in the riots. It's not because the community did it, it's because somebody knows the power that juxtaposition arts has in North Minneapolis.
Right.
So, and they were able to respond immediately with a beautiful art mural.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the point, right? And we're watching that happen, but you know, for so long we've been just kind of doing it thinking, you know, I just want to learn how to paint. Well, yes, but how do you use your voice?
Right.
What is your voice? What are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
So I think that that's kind of where I'm at. If and I don't know, I mean, it's not like we're in a space, I mean, I don't know the community well, but it's not, you know, it's still a vacation community, you know, people getting away from those realities, but it's felt.
So first, introduce yourself.
Okay, hi, I'm Heidi Jeub. I'm an artist who lives in St. Joseph, Minnesota. Abstract painter, bookbinder, and public artist. So that's all I can say right now. You have to ask me all the other questions.
I have to ask all the other questions. Okay. Well, welcome to the studio.
Okay, you know what? It's funny. My influences aren't necessarily, I should say my original influences come out of my study of architecture back in the 90s. I studied architecture for 2 years before I left the program because I realized I didn't know where the Louvre was. And I felt that was a sign that I really had a lot more to learn than I expected. But in that period, I happened to be at a college down in Missouri where we almost had a hybrid between art and architecture rather than engineering and architecture. And so that was actually very rare. So we really got a different type of design training. And so my influences probably originally did land in architecture. So it would have been Bauhaus or Kandinsky was a painter that I actually really did resonate with. I also was a big jazz fan when I was in high school. So I appreciated visual representations of music.
Right.
Influenced at least what I, as my professor said, what I was turned on by. So like if I was turned on by something, it was usually because there was some sort of energy behind it that was more like, it was more like a jam session that you didn't know when it was going to end.
Right.
Rather than a pop tune. I use that actually as an explanation when I teach abstraction.
Yeah.
Like, you can kind of know where you're heading, but you don't know when it's going to end, and so you just keep going. And so that was, I would say that attitude has always landed in my work. Not until recently, 2016, I ended up delivering a show out to Denver, and in Denver they had the women abstractionists from New York, well, mostly New York. And this show was like coming home to me. Keep in mind, my art history background was almost all men. Like, I think Georgia O'Keeffe was the only woman I've ever really knew as an artist in the programming that I was in. 2016 was when I finally saw that show in Denver. And so I think like Lee Krasner was one of the women that I liked. I think there was something about her attitude on canvas that I did finally read about her. The funny thing is, I don't have any interest reading art history books until all of a sudden I'm like, there's something about this person I really like, and so then I'll peek out.
Yeah.
And because of that show too, there was a emergence of a lot of articles about these artists too. And then also the fact that they're starting to just realize that women haven't been represented in our world. So I got to the point where I was changing out my art classes. For instance, I'd use famous artist examples, which I really want to undo anyway, because it's a whole other issue. But what I realized I was doing was I was using the typical Picasso, Van Gogh, whatever, to explain these concepts. And it's like, you know, that's like beating a dead horse of opportunity when it comes to the plethora of arts influences we have in our
Completely. Right.
world and our history. So, but then also when I was opened up to more women, I was like, okay, well, I am one, so that helps.
Right.
And so this has just been I think that, I guess though, one of the things that is part that's in my soul when I make work is that I was a woman in a male-dominated field for that period. I guess it was education, but you know, you still were one of 3 women in an architecture class of 75 students.
Yeah.
And then you're targeted constantly for your, in my case, my aggressive nature.
Yeah.
People were like, yeah, and I didn't understand that that was because I was more like the guys and I could hang with the guys.
Yeah.
I didn't understand that that needed to change. And so, and from that perspective, right, of this is the norm and you need to fit within that
Right.
norm. And so as a woman in that field, I realized I was trying to shed that a little bit, but I was too young to really understand or identify what I was experiencing. So I've reflected back on that idea of being a woman in that field, why I left, what were the exceptions, what were the things that were being taught to girls versus boys. I unpacked a lot of that stuff over time. And I did actually a series of collages that are kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's a really long series. It's called Reasons Why I Possibly Dropped Out of Architecture School. And it's just basically, I superimposed images from science and engineering magazines with like homemaking magazines. And like, what would happen if we would have changed out our toys or taught our daughters how to use a hammer?
Right.
Or whatever, because you would fail going, I don't even know what I'm doing right here.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, but the thing is that at that same, you know, that's one thing. That's just a societal thing that many people battle. But one of the things that I ended up doing was I realized that you overcompensate in a sense, right? So when I got into public art, I realized that because I had this architecture background, but I didn't necessarily have the functional, this is how I build this sculpture.
Yeah.
And I could walk into a room with a bunch of metal workers or a small group or a team and say, this is what I envision and I trust that you can do it.
Right.
And, but I took ownership of the vision and then gave them the partnership, meet me halfway here. Right. It doesn't always work, but I found team members who I treat them like a team. So like they can push back and we can push and pull and give suggestions and we make mistakes together. We you know, kind of problem solve through different ideas, but I enjoyed that later in life type of experience of just working in that field. And it's not, public art is not architecture, but it is. You're working with relationship of space and object. And it's the same exact thing. I actually look, that background in architecture isn't about the piece, or that when it affects how I work on my work, because what my work does is it creates a relationship to the experience that the viewer is gonna get. So sometimes even if I have some odd pieces that don't quite fit, I'm always like, oh, I should just get rid of this, you know, and because it doesn't go with this, it doesn't create an experience for the person viewing the work. Right. And that's my own personal struggle. And it was a lot worse when I was younger, but not younger, 5 years ago. But you know,
well, you were younger
when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But no, I think I became more regimen and my practice that there is some cohesiveness. It's just the gesture might change, the composition might change or whatever, but I do have a few things that kind of link into each other
Yep.
with as I move on down my career. So